Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Lambert, and this is the first of a webinar organized by Business Architecture Info. If time permits, we'll try to have one a month. And the first subject is zero trust and enterprise architecture. Um, Security is a very important topic. As an entrepreneur, I struggle with it because it slows you down, but it's more and more necessary. And they are people paid in some countries that it's their regular job trying to rob those that have money, and they're getting pretty good at it. And if you are not protected correctly, you're in for a very big surprise and disappointing surprise. Um, Today, our presenter is Jason Garbis. He's the founder and principal at Numberline Security. He is also the co-chair of Zero Trust Working Group at Cloud Security Alliance. Um, he's the author of two books, Zero Trust Security, an Enterprise Guide, and Getting Started with Zero Trust. He is the former Chief Product Officer at Appgate. If you want some information about security and zero trust, there are two links there. You can also connect with Jason on LinkedIn. The second link is his LinkedIn profile.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm really looking forward to this today, and I think that hopefully when we go through this, we'll be able to make it clear how security can be more than something that slows you down, but actually be an enabler for better and more effective processes. And that I think is oftentimes the key to overcoming organizational resistance to change is, hey, yes, we're improving security, but we're allowing the business to do this, adopt this new technology or improve this process. And that's how you win friends and influence people and make your zero trust program successful. So, thank you, Daniel.
No problem. And we at Business Architecture Info, we have industry-based frameworks, and in there, among enterprise support, there's security management, a level 1 capability. It's not because it's number 60 that it's not important. It's extremely important. It involves either data, device, security management, security application management, security awareness and training, uh, continuous monitoring, detection management, network traffic management, performance management, policy, recovery, response management, risk management, threat protection management, user identity management, and everything that's got to do with access. In total, the framework that I'm showing you has 52 business capabilities under the level 1 security management. And it's also spread out everywhere else in other level 1 capabilities, because it's not just a few folks that should be involved with security. Everyone needs to take into account security, and in the energy and electric industry, at minimum, you should also be taking care of security at those levels. And also, when you're examining a value stream, it is imperative that while you're examining a value stream with either the participating stakeholder, like you see there today, or with the enabling capability or the required information, that you take into account security. On that note, I'm leaving the floor to Jason.
Great, thanks, Daniel. And those intro slides were deliberate because it helps us, I think, frame up security as this set of capabilities, the 52 capabilities that Daniel mentioned. But that's really only one way to think about it, kind of maybe the vertical. And the horizontal is really the business process or the business architecture view. And this is one representative example of the business process. We chose it from the energy sector of connecting the client's facility up to the transmission grid. And there's a number of steps there. And the thing to think about is throughout all these steps, there is involvement with an IT, or in this case, some sort of OT system or both. The user needs to interact with an application or data. And the whole structure around this is, how is that user authenticated? What is that user authorized to do and not to do? And how can and should an organization, looking at it from a business architecture perspective, think about and model the roles and responsibilities around this? And this is really the challenge of security. And the framework of zero trust, I think, as we go through this presentation, will hopefully make clear, number one, the power that it brings, but also the necessity that we have for this. So let's go ahead and dive in, if I can navigate here. Oops. Okay, so we can step back and say, okay, well, where are we today from a technology perspective, from a business perspective? Hopefully we're not lost in the desert, and we do have a sense of this. And the reality is that our businesses are essentially 100% digital. Through my very scientific research, you can see I came up with 97%. But the reality is that everything that we're doing is utilizing technology. We're using a computer to access some sort of system, performing a task, and almost everything we do, even though, of course, we do real world tasks. We have doctors and healthcare professionals operating and treating patients. We have people in restaurants. We have people in manufacturing that are operating systems. But all of these things are tied into a digital infrastructure that's collecting data or driving the business process or allowing things to happen. And what this takes us to is a world where our business is completely reliant on access to systems and to data. And we see this due to the unfortunate prevalence of ransomware and how dramatically it impacts an organization when it's hit, and the organization gets stopped in its tracks. And we see this time and time again. We saw this week with one of the Las Vegas casino groups, where they were hit with ransomware and things were completely shut down. We've seen it time and time again with hospital systems and others. And this relates back to the malicious actors that Daniel mentioned, whose full-time job it is to infiltrate our organizations, to disrupt them either for criminal purposes, for political purposes, to steal intellectual property, or to steal financial assets from us. And it's extraordinarily disruptive to our way of life, to our freedom and our economy. And it's also very dangerous, clearly, to us as human beings who need to go to the hospital to get treated, or who are trying to travel somewhere and our transportation is impacted. So this is what gets me up early in the morning is the notion that we as a cybersecurity, as information security professionals, are really working to defend and make resilient the systems and the processes and the organizations that we all rely on every single day. Now, this is a way of thinking about the concept that Daniel mentioned of these very highly motivated and ubiquitous threat actors. And they're everywhere geographically, they're everywhere virtually, and they're very creative at looking at ways that they can penetrate an organization. And we see this all the time, whether it's phishing links that are getting better and better with AI-generated content and structure, whether it's continued research and exploitation of 0 days. Apple just released an update this week for some no-click 0 days that a malicious actor could use to send a crafted image in a text message and then infiltrate your phone. And of course, there's a lot of, to use a European football analogy, soccer in the US, lots of own goals, right? We have lots of organizations who still have not addressed some of the basic vulnerabilities of having open and unpatched VPN servers, having too wide open networks that's just inviting malicious actors to take advantage of this. So it's really about understanding, doing some of the basics, but also moving toward this more advanced model where your network, your devices, your users, your applications, and your data are all much more resilient, so that when the attacker gets in, when some ransomware gets installed onto a device, yes, that device is compromised and that device has to be destroyed or repurposed, but the ransomware doesn't have the opportunity to spread across the network because we put in place a proper set of controls. Okay, all right. And I think at this, we all know and I think understand this at a certain level, which is that the traditional perimeter-based flat network and authentication only approach to security has really failed us. And part of this is because those systems and those architectures simply weren't designed for the world that we live in, the world of these advanced, highly motivated, highly persistent threat actors who continually try to take advantage of this. It's also hindered by some of the technology choices that underlie this are inherently open, TCP/IP networking, and the fact that many organizations have not invested in security. They've invested in IT, and IT has really been motivated and focused on availability and making sure the systems are operating, make sure the network is up and running and provides a high bandwidth and low latency experience. And the security side of things is too often an afterthought or something that's tried to be overlaid on top of this. And we know that that doesn't work very well. And the good news is, or I should say, the conclusion here is that we need a new approach. And the important thing about this new approach, this thing we call zero trust, is that it's not starting from scratch. It's a thoughtful set of principles that have been developed by a lot of people over a long time that utilizes and leverages the best practices, sound principles, and the widely adopted technology standards that have been built and deployed over the decades, and takes those and puts those together in a new way that is going to be much more effective. So this is not about throwing anything away, except maybe your VPN and maybe a NAC. It's about taking the things that we know work around role-based access control, around step-up authentication, around multi-factor authentication, around the principle of least privilege, around network segmentation, and combining them in a way that is much more dynamic, much more contextually aware, and cuts across traditional gaps in our security architectures. And most importantly, it takes the traditional gap that exists between identity and role and the network and ties those together so that we have a much more effective environment. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, this of course is what we call zero trust. And zero trust, I'll talk through a couple of quotes here. So the first is from the US National Institute for Standards and Technology document called Zero Trust Architectures. It's number special publication 800-207. And they talk about zero trust as a set of cybersecurity paradigms that moves defenses from, we'll say, traditional static and network-based perimeters to something that's more focused on users, assets, and resources. So the things that are actually meaningful to the business and meaningful to us as people who want and need to set policy. And we'll talk in a few slides about policy. And quoting President Biden from the executive order from just a couple of years ago, they define this as zero trust security model that eliminates this notion of implicit trust in any one component, and instead requires continuous verification through real-time information to determine access and other system responses. So those elements of it are really important. Is we're moving away from a traditional perimeter-based model, the notion of the M&M, where you got a hard exterior and a soft interior, and instead moving to something where nothing is implicitly trusted. Just because it's a node on our enterprise network doesn't mean that it's going to be necessarily allowed to do anything, that it needs to be evaluated from an identity, from a device perspective, and from a fully rich contextual set of contextual information to then dynamically determine what that identity, what that device should be allowed to access. The key here is that zero trust isn't a product and it isn't an architecture, although we can and we do all build zero trust architectures. It's a set of principles for, as NIST says, workflow, system design, and operations. And there's really 4 core elements of this. The first is that all communication is secured regardless of network location. And I interpret it as no matter where the user is, whether they're at home or in the corporate environment or in some sort of secure facility like a SCIF, no matter what device they're on, and no matter what resource they're trying to access or where that resource lives, that security, that access needs to be secured. And what that does is it gets us to start thinking away from, well, I've got this remote access solution, which happens to be called a VPN, and that's used for my users when they're remote. And it's got some technology, it's got some hardware, I've got some rules or policies in it. And when they come into the office, guess what? They don't use the VPN, they use something completely different, a different technology, a different policy model. Maybe it even comes from a different vendor. And Zero Trust says, you really shouldn't think about it that way. Don't think of it as remote access or local access. It's just access. And you want to have one model for enforcement and policy around that. And that in and of itself drives tremendous efficiency and a tremendous reduction in complexity because you just have one policy model. The second principle is that access to resources is determined by dynamic policy. So policies, a zero trust policy, needs to adapt and understand who the user is, what attributes have we captured about that user. Some of these things are going to come from an identity management system. Some of them are going to come from the device. Some of them are going to come from the user itself, like geolocation. Some are going to come from the system itself, like what time of day is it? Is our system under attack? Have they badged into the building, which could be a factor? All of those things feed into the policy decision point, which takes us to the third bullet point, that all resource authentication, and more importantly, the authorization, is dynamic and it's strictly enforced. So there's the notion of a policy decision point that makes a determination about should this identity using this device be allowed to access this particular resource at this point in time. And if and only if the answer to that is yes, should that access be allowed? Otherwise, a zero trust system needs to operate under a default deny policy. And what that gets us to is it gets us away from our big flat enterprise network that relies only on authentication and therefore gives attackers the ability to do reconnaissance, take advantage of known vulnerabilities in a system, and basically do a lot of damage even without any sort of authentication. And it moves us to a world of, if you don't have a legitimate reason, you and your device have a legitimate reason to access something, you're not allowed to access it. I work in finance. I can access the finance servers through the web UI. That's what I have to do my job. Fantastic. I can't try to SSH to the finance server. I certainly shouldn't be even allowed to get to the login screen to the source code control system because it has nothing to do with my job. Doing that, this principle of least privilege is best practices, and it marches the organization a long way toward attaining the values and the principles of zero trust. Finally, the last principle is that the enterprise is actively monitoring and measuring the integrity of the system, the security posture, and operating the operations of the network. So it's a way of saying, let's make sure there's some instrumentation in there that gives us a baseline, that lets us look for anomalies, and it gives us a way to, through both manual and automated responses, react to incidents or react to anomalies. So a zero trust system is a system built on these principles, and it shifts security from the traditional, and I think we all agree, ineffective, perimeter-centric model to one that's resource and identity-centric. And a zero trust system is something that acts as an integrated platform for your organization, and it uses this contextual information from the identity system, from security infrastructure, from your IT environment, to then enable the dynamic enforcement of these security policies uniformly across the enterprise. Not uniformly in the sense that everyone or everything gets the same access, but that you've got this holistic system that can enforce policies locally based on the identities and based on the attributes of the resources being accessed. And the result is pretty appealing to organizations. You get continuously adaptive access controls, improved security, and you're starting to deliver business value. You're reducing risk, you're simplifying the operations, you're making the organization more resilient, and you're increasing business agility by enabling the adoption of new technologies in a secure way. So if we think about what zero trust looks like, this is a diagram from the NIST document. And what I like about it is it introduces some of the core principles of, first of all, the notion of a policy decision point up at the top that lives in this logical control plane. That's where the policy engine lies, and that's where the administration mechanism is to define these policies. But ultimately, this PDP, the policy decision point, makes a decision about whether a given subject, you can see in the lower left, using some sort of device, some system, is allowed to access a given enterprise resource at this point in time. That access goes through the data plane and has to go through a policy enforcement point. Now, this is a logical view, but conceptually, the network traffic is going from the system through the policy enforcement point to the enterprise resource. And if it's allowed, that traffic can go through and the user or the subject can access the data or the application. And if it's blocked, of course, it can't. What I like about this diagram is that you have these 8 boxes on the sides there that shows this is input and context that goes into the system, and it's used by the policy decision point, and may even be used by the policy enforcement point to help inform and make its decision about should this user on this device be allowed to access this resource at this point in time. So let's take a look at policies in a little bit more detail. This slide, before we dive into that, is just a slightly different view, and it shows us, starting at the bottom, we have complex and heterogeneous environments. They're made up of resources in lots of different locations, utilizing lots of different types of technologies. And that complexity is often the enemy of security. And what ideally we'll have is an environment or a system where we have a distributed set of policy enforcement points that know how to talk to and interact with this heterogeneous set of technologies on the bottom. And there's a pretty broad set there, everything from traditional on-prem physical to a cloud-based infrastructure or platform as a service to maybe a cloud-native Kubernetes containerized environment, or maybe even a service mesh, IoT, et cetera. So there's a lot of diversity there. But what you want and need is a holistic zero trust policy model that provides some level of simplicity and normalization on top of that. So now you have this centralized policy decision point that lets the organization define per identity and per resource policies that are aware of the context and the events that come from the enterprise infrastructure, and allow ultimately users, both human and non-human, to access these resources through this set of policy enforcement points. The system itself needs to be dynamic and be able to respond to risk and event-based action. So we have, for example, some users' endpoint management system indicates some sort of indication of compromise or anomalous activity. That event needs to flow through, change the risk level for that user, and most likely have an impact on what that user can access. My endpoint management system sees some weird activity on my device. I should probably have a change to what I can access. Maybe I get quarantined from the network. Maybe I'm prompted for MFA using some sort of out-of-band mechanism. Maybe I get cut off from everything except the help desk, and then the IT team calls me. Those are all reasonable responses to some red alert that's coming from an endpoint management system, and an example of the types of things that we can provide through a zero trust architecture. So let's dive into policies, which really are the heart of zero trust. Now, I'm really going out on a limb here and saying, hey, firewall rules aren't policies. And if you think about it, firewall rule is something like what's shown there at the bottom. It's I'm either allowing or disallowing a given source IP address to access a given destination IP address or network range on a given port. And these are policies that only a firewall engineer could love, right? Because yeah, they're technically interesting, but they're really meaningless, because I have no way of looking at this and making any sort of determination about, is this a good rule? Is this a bad rule? Who or what is that 3.11 IP address? What's on this 10.1 network? Who knows? So this is how, of course, traditionally firewalls and networks have been configured. And even in modern cloud environments, these capabilities exist, right, as network security groups or security groups. And this is a really poor way of modeling security because it's a very network-centric view. And from a zero trust perspective, we really need to look at it differently. And this model here, these screenshots, are from the what's referred to as the NSTAC report. So this is the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee. And so this is a committee made up of industry experts, and they were commissioned to create this report to the president of the US, in this case around zero trust and trusted identity management. So they came up with this model they call the Kipling model that says a zero trust policy needs to describe the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And those are things that are, of course, should be answered in meaningful, hopefully English language terms that then get translated and mapped to those policy enforcement points that we talked about. So the example they give here is, for my administrators who want to be able to access this directory administration tool, they can only do it if they are in the right directory group. I want them to have access 24/7. It needs to go through the IDS with DPAC inspection, and they have to be MFA'd. They have to have MFA applied. That type of policy is something that's a little bit more meaningful. We look at it from another example. The question here that is how we were traditionally forced to answer or model policies. Should this source IP be allowed to access that target IP? Well, I don't know the answer to that. And because I don't know who or what is using that source IP address, that's probably going to change when someone turns off their device, and then that IP address gets handed out by the DHCP server to the next person. And really, what we need to do is say, no, we're not going to model policies that way. We're going to have our firewalls basically say, we're not going to allow any traffic through unless it comes from the policy enforcement point. And then we're going to let the policy enforcement point make do the enforcement and enforce the policies there and allow or disallow the traffic. Really, we want to be able to have a policy that lets us answer the question, should Alice be allowed to access the financial system web UI? Now, that's a meaningful policy because we know something about Alice. We know what her role is in the organization. She's a CFO. She should be allowed to access the financial system web UI because that's part of her job. But we could say, you know what, it really could be a little even higher level than that and say, under what circumstances should an identity be allowed to access the financial system web UI? And then what we can say is, you know what, we're going to have some attributes here. Number one, they need to be an employee. They need to be in the finance team group in our directory, which means, guess what? We have a whole set of identity management processes around that to make sure the right people are in the group, and there are governance processes so that when someone changes roles, when they leave the company, et cetera, that they get removed from the group. So that's a way of let us leverage the infrastructure and the work that our teams have done there. They can access the system if they're on a company managed device, right? And our endpoint management system says that their risk score is less than 75. Likewise, there's additional attributes that we can put here around location, MFA, et cetera, et cetera. Now, all of a sudden, this is a really meaningful policy that is useful for us as enterprise architects, as security architects, as compliance people, and as business owners, application owners. So if I am the application owner for the financial system web application, now I can say, yeah, this is how I want to constrain which people can access this. So this is light years ahead of the first policy there around IP addresses. And this is exactly where we need to go from a policy model perspective. Okay, so let's talk about I know we've got about 10, 12 minutes left, a case study. So this is a real world enterprise. This is actually the Financial Systems Regulatory Authority here in the United States. And this is, they have been public about this. I've anonymized it here, but they've been fairly public about this cloud migration case study. So this organization here in the US has a big and important job, which is to monitor all trades in the US equities, stock, futures markets for fraud. And they have over 2,000 analysts whose job it is to look at this data, find anomalies, et cetera, et cetera. And ultimately, this can turn into criminal investigations around that. Now, This organization, of course, has been around for decades, and they had built out their own infrastructure, custom software, running on traditional mainframes, running in their own data centers. And about almost 10 years ago, they decided to move up into one of the major cloud providers for lots of different reasons. They wanted to be able to take advantage of new modern cloud architectures. They wanted to reduce their costs because think about their business model. They utilize this compute infrastructure very, very heavily from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., 5 days a week. And it's almost completely idle off hours. So it's a perfect fit for the pay-as-you-go model for infrastructure as a service. They also wanted to better and more easily meet their compliance requirements and operate at scale. They weren't doing a great job before this of enforcing and limiting access control to these giant data sets. So what they did was, what they did was to create this environment in the cloud. And this is a very, very high level view, but they created, in fact, they ended up open sourcing this workload request system. Access is controlled through a zero trust policy enforcement point, and users have the zero trust client installed on their desktop. When a user says, you know what, I need to look at a slice of data for trades for company X from October of last year, they'd go to the workload request system, put in those parameters, and click go. What happens behind the scenes is this system will provision a temporary workload, spin up a data slice and an instance in this cloud environment, temporarily provision access and update the access policy inside the zero trust system. And now, 3-4 minutes later, that user and only that user gets access to that workload with the requested data set. No other user gets access to it on the network so that it's secure and protected. Then the user does their job. The access to this is logged for compliance reporting purposes without any sort of human intervention. And when the user finishes their work on this, 2 hours later, they say, you know what, I looked at this, everything looks clean. They go back to the workload request system, they say, deprovision this, and that workload is destroyed and deleted, and that access policy goes away, so that even if that workload's IP address gets reused 10 minutes later, that user's not going to have access to it. So this was a very successful project for them. Their users love the new system. It's much more dynamic. The application developers also like this because it let them use much more modern tool sets with graphical user interface and big data analytics. They were able to successfully decommission their data centers, and they saved money as part of all of this. And from a compliance perspective, they are now fully and completely and most importantly, automatically meeting their compliance requirements without any sort of manual reporting. And the interesting thing about this is that this system really operates at scale. That process that I mentioned happens in excess of 30,000 times a day. And those 2,000 analysts that I mentioned over a given day will each launch around approximately 15 workloads per day. So this has to happen completely automated in order to operate at that scale. So things that I think we can take away from this are, number one, is that zero trust can enable a strategic initiative. And in this case, they wouldn't have been able to do this without this very dynamic policy model. And that enterprise architecture and zero trust security, they're really two sides of the same coin. You can't really do one without the other, because zero trust as a security philosophy can and should and must be part of all of our architecture decisions. Zero trust at its heart is about these dynamic policies, and dynamic policies, in order to be dynamic, need a set of real-time data. They need a way to utilize APIs to integrate with identity systems and endpoint management systems and infrastructure systems. And the good news is that we have a ton of APIs and a ton of ways to do this. In some cases, in fact, a way that doesn't require coding today. There's so much no-code integration that this is really a productive way to do this using modern zero trust platforms. Self-service and automated provisioning, people love that. It happens quickly. You click a button, you get access to it, you do your job. And this is a way for us to learn that even though this environment is very secure, no one except the authorized user gets access to that workload. It's temporary, it gets destroyed. The users don't know that it's secure. All the users see is, I got this new modern portal, I put in my parameters, I click a button, 3 minutes later, I get access to the data set, I got all these great tools, and when I'm done, I click a button and I'm done, and I don't have to do anything else. And most importantly, I don't have to fill out a spreadsheet or track what I'm accessing. All this compliance and audit reporting is done automatically behind the scenes. Now, this is one of Daniel's slides where he's talking about these 4 steps to a successful digital transformation project. And the key about this is that all along this process here, organizations can and should be thinking about security, because you can't do access without security. You can't do security without thinking about access and this thing from an architectural perspective. So as security professionals, this, I think, is sometimes a challenge for us, because as a security professional, look, we love technology, we love security, and that isn't always the hardest part of a project here, even though we think it's the most interesting part. The hardest part is often understanding and getting organizational buy-in for a zero trust initiative and tying what we're doing to business value. Now, in the example I gave, clearly that organization had a very strategic made a very strategic decision to say, we're going to transition from a mainframe up to a cloud environment. And that was a big investment. And it was a great opportunity for the security team to say, fantastic, we're fully on board with supporting this. This is how we're going to do this. And we're going to make it, yes, we're going to make it more secure, but we're going to make it more efficient. We're going to allow this to happen. And that oftentimes is the biggest challenge. So as a security professional, I'd encourage you to start to build bridges with your peers, start to understand or work to understand what is your organization's set of missions or challenges. And it might be, we want to solve this problem. Maybe it's, we had an audit finding or something like that. Or it might be, we're doing this big strategic initiative to enter a new market or launch a new digital product or reduce costs by moving things from here to there. Those are great opportunities to build a security practice and to tie your zero trust initiative to something that's got momentum inside the organization. So I encourage you all to learn more about zero trust if you haven't already. So there's some excellent resources out there, and a few of them are listed here. So the kind of the foundational thing is the NIST Special Publication 800-207, the Zero Trust Architecture document. The second one is the CISA's Zero Trust Maturity Model. That was updated not that long ago, just a few months ago. And that's really become a fairly de facto standard in the industry. The third one is the NSTAC report that I mentioned. And the fourth one is my book, Zero Trust Security, an Enterprise Guide. There's lots of other resources out there as well. Some of them are specific to vendors. Many of them are not, and are also useful. It is a complicated world because our enterprises are complicated, but there are a lot of terrific resources to help you get started in a way that is incremental and iterative. So with that, I want to wrap it up, see if we have any questions that are coming in, Daniel. I do encourage folks to learn about the principles of zero trust. Definitely try to internalize the CISA Zero Trust Maturity Model. I have a couple of resources that I've listed here. In particular, I've created a free and open version of the CISA maturity model in a spreadsheet form that includes some interactivity, as well as a free zero trust readiness survey that'll take you about 10 to 15 minutes to fill out, and then you'll be emailed a customized report based on that. I do encourage organizations to, especially if you're just getting started with zero trust, is to start small. Find a project that delivers value to the business, even if it's small and focused, something that you can do in just a couple of months. And that will help you learn, and it will also help you build momentum for continued support in zero trust.
Do I ever agree with you, Jason? Start small, have success, people will love you, and then you'll be able to do bigger projects. Okay, I have a question from Jean-Noël Gérard, and I guess he's in France, and it goes with mine. Aside from the military folks and the governments in the US, is it used elsewhere, and is it used in outside the United States and in Europe, to be more specific. He wants Europe examples.
It's definitely a global phenomenon. And I know that the examples I gave all came from the US government. And that's something that the US government has deliberately made an investment in publishing and being very vocal about this. But we have seen public initiatives around zero trust coming from the UK, which I know it's not in Europe anymore, Australia, Singapore, Japan, I believe Estonia as well. I have not seen anything really public from the EU.
Estonia is Europe, Jason.
Yes, I'm aware of that. I did pass basic geography, but I don't know if I've seen anything from the EU as opposed to an EU member country. We all know Estonia is very digitally advanced.
Yeah.
But so there definitely are organizations that are, number one, outside the US, number two, governments outside the US that are doing this. So it is global phenomenon. Yep.
Now, I've personally been involved with a lab in your neck, in the greater Boston region, a very good lab from a very notorious university. And, they take access extremely seriously. I had to provide a course for 3 days and could not provide it with my laptop. And how long does it take to implement zero trust in an organization?
Well, zero trust is a philosophy. So adopting that philosophy can be quick, but executing and implementing an architecture based on that is a journey. We've seen organizations that adopt and deploy a basic zero trust platform very, very quickly in a matter of weeks. Other organizations certainly take longer than that, and it depends completely on the level of maturity, the scope of what an organization is doing, and to what degree they want to start to define policies for how broad of a user set. So I've seen organizations that deploy over 100,000 users onto a zero trust platform in just 3 or 4 months. Now, they were able to do that because they were technically sophisticated, and they deliberately said, we're going to do this, and we're going to start to get better access control, but they're still going to define very broad network access because they didn't have the maturity to be able to say, I know that these people need access just to this. So they deployed the infrastructure. They got benefits from an authentication perspective, from an endpoint context perspective. And then once they did that, they started to dial down the access. Conversely, I've seen other organizations that, and I'll say this is a little bit of a mistake, is they tried to put in place, and they went down a pathway of needing to satisfy all of the checkboxes. Does it meet full compliance? Is it operationally mature? How does it tie into our backup and recovery, et cetera, et cetera? It took them a long time, really over a year, before they were able to get any substantial number of users onboarded. And it was an uphill battle because they kept facing pushback versus other organizations that say, you know what, we have this problem with our developers, and they're unable to access our new IaaS environments efficiently because they have to keep switching, et cetera. We're just going to deploy it for these 250 people. And 3 weeks later, it was deployed, and then they built on that from there. So that type of iterative model really accelerates time to value and accelerates growth up the maturity curve.
Hey, Jason, we have one last question from Abhishek. What guidance would you have for someone who is a solution architect, senior developer, to transition to security architecture, especially when there is less probability to be involved in real world hands-on project?
So I think I understand the question. So someone's an enterprise architect at some organization, and they want to transition to more of a security perspective. Certainly, there's a ton of freely available resources about zero trust to help you learn about it. And I would say, to whatever
you've mentioned
to whatever degree you're able to become a champion for zero trust in your organization, that's going to help you grow professionally. whether it's partnering with the security team or helping drive this, that can help grow your stature and your visibility. And use this as an opportunity to learn in that enterprise, in your business, what are the drivers, what is the business trying to accomplish, and that will help elevate you. And then finally, don't be afraid to talk about this publicly. Now, obviously, you might need to anonymize certain things, but we as an industry don't always do a good job of sharing our case studies and sharing our successes. And I think, especially for something like zero trust, which is a huge industry buzzword, there is some backlash, there's some skepticism around this. Oh, zero trust is just, you know, the latest flavor and it's going to be something else next month. That demonstrating and saying, no, here's what we did with zero trust in our organization and how we benefited can help you grow professionally and start to be perceived as a security leader, both inside and outside your organization.
Okay, great, Jason. Thanks a lot. It was very interesting. And should you want to know more, you can communicate with me or with or connect with Jason directly on LinkedIn, and we'll go from there. Thanks for popping by, and I hope that you also enjoyed it. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.